Before I talk about the game, I want to talk about the studio first. Capcom, or I'm going to call them, No Capcom. Throughout my gaming hobby, I dabbed into some of their franchises, and besides the Street Fighter games, I didn't give two fucks about them. Mega Man 11 2001 is a platformer that is usually difficult and I can't get myself into it because of difficulty. We also have Resident Evil 2 Remake, and I started that game when I first started the backlog, and it's kinda stressful and I think it made me overwhelmed, so I stopped. And I was playing Pokemon Sword at the time as well, which could also be a factor into why I stopped. And now we got Monster Hunter Rise, a Nintendo Switch exclusive of this action RPG adventure in which you kill dinosaurs and dragons. It came out on March 26, 2021, and with good to great reception. I managed to get this game at Best Buy in the American Dream Mall in New Jersey, and started to play that game on Friday. And I have mixed feelings towards this game. On one hand, it's a satisfying adventure with some nice presentation and the combat has a lot of potential. But on the other, I found that mostly early on, it's a shit show with many quality of life improvements not present and thus making the game feel a little difficult or unfair sometimes. Over time, I realized that this game for me was a learning experience to understand how the game works and how well it manages to do so. This is the myth, the legend, Squidward 5, and this is my video essay on Monster Hunter Rise and how it made me learn to understand the concepts of the game. Peekaboo! What does Monster Hunter have for a story? It has fucking nothing. I mean, it does have a story, but it's very basic and just there because it's mandatory. All it does is that a threat has came to the village once again, and it's up to you to stop the crazy creature named Magnamala. You know, a typical story about how we want to promote ourselves as a superior species and how we hate wildlife. That's pretty much it. What this tells me is that the developers would rather focus on gameplay than tell a deep story, and that's okay. Not every game wants to do so, but one thing the game does a decent job at is character interactions and development. While not really affecting the story, several characters have their own purpose in the game and do it well. Let's first start with the leader of the village, and although doesn't really do much but just guide the characters to their goals, is a likable character because his personality and his heart is in the right place. He could be a good teacher if he could because of this one scene in which he tells people about their place and how they do it well. You also have other ones like the girls who give you quests, girl who gives you food, and a few others. While basic, have personalities and the voice acting really make them come alive, which is a major plus. Except for this one dude you mostly see early on in the game and your character. It just exists to become a hunter and that's it. Heck, when you first start playing it, you would have to customize it to your liking. And also your other side characters, this cat and this dog, which isn't a bad thing since character customization can be fun. Another thing is that the voice actor has some really bad moments, such as during the quest when the monsters are running away, or if he/she dies and more. While the game has no story to carry itself, they can rely on some side characters and the voice acting to help make it more than just beat the fuck out of the monsters. And that's basically what you do in this game, fight monsters. Let me explain in more detail. The game sets itself up as in, you start in the village in which you prepare yourself to upgrade gear, eat for stat bonuses, and get items you need to fight the monsters. While basic like the story, I'll explain in more details on certain stuff. For upgrading weapons, the UI feels off many times, which I don't understand why this is the case, but that isn't the issue. My main issue is that upgrading weapons are mostly just getting the money and getting the right materials, which on paper is very standard, but since you will be fighting these monsters mostly only once per quest, it's somewhat hard to get these materials without grinding, but this is just me nitpicking on these details. I'll also add that you can have up to one weapon to use while fighting, which can be a downside, but with how the game works, I'm not too angry. You can also ask to do town quests in which you accept people's requests and start to do them while you're doing your regular quests. Another thing you can do to prepare is to eat this Japanese kebabbles, which you can have up to 3 different ones, which will give you stat bonuses. And getting items is just getting items with an odd UI. Once you're ready, we would go to one of the quest girls and start a quest. They're usually leveled 1 through 5, so the difficulty gets harder with each one, but I'll explain that in a minute. You can also do optional quests, which is just kill X amount of monsters or get a certain amount of materials. Once we get that, we can start the quest and do some final stuff before we head out. And now we start. Usually missions will give you a 15-minute time limit, but it doesn't feel like, since usually the quests are like 10 to 40 minutes. You have typical locations like deserts, forests, and lakes in many different forms, like in a tundra setting or a rainforest. You have a camp to get your items and change your gear, and once you feel confident, you can start exploring. The worlds are filled with biodiversity with a lot of life and a lot of materials such as flowers, mushrooms, and even bugs, which increase stats even more. You have the smaller monsters, which are usually dinosaurs, and they're usually the easiest ones to kill, but it's expected once you get a higher level gear. And now let's talk about what you can do here. You're mostly just killing the larger monsters, 1 per quest or in rare occasions 2. In the earlier levels, it's just fetch quests, but that's because your equipment is not strong enough yet. And now let's talk about why at first this part didn't do much for me, or how it's very flawed. When fighting the monsters, it's usually a boss fight in which it takes a while for them to be beaten. I'm not saying it's bad, but some things make it slightly off par with other action RPGs. For most of the battles, I feel like the enemies always have an advantage, but that's expected since it gets slightly harder as the game progresses. Or maybe I wasn't well prepared when it comes to figuring them out. Also, from my understanding, each one doesn't have a health bar, which means it's always a mystery of how long it takes to fight them. Another thing would be that they would run away and you would have to chase them to a certain spot on the map. Not a criticism, but it's just something that happens often. Once you're done with figuring them out, you can collect stuff that's inside them and you can use them to improve weapons or make new ones. Besides the main stuff, you can do optional stuff in this different quest menu area inside this hut, and you can play with other players to defeat those monsters as well. But it's optional, and I find myself having some fun with it, especially early on with the game, and that's the game for you. But it's optional, and I find myself having some fun with it, especially early on with the game, and that's the game for you. During my playthrough, I've understand how the game works and how it can be really fun over time, but certain flaws I mentioned have kept the game from being great. The idea is there, and I can see the effort in front of me, but the game itself has some quality of life issues that make it less accessible for new players, along with how there is no easy mode. Even though going into the game, I know that it won't have a difficulty option before I even purchase it. As for the game itself, it could take around 10 to 20 hours just to beat the campaign stuff, which can be short if you're just playing the main stuff. During when this is being recorded, there's plans to release DLC called Sunbreak for summer 2022, and that's gonna help with adding more stuff to do, even if it's basically the same thing. Unless you absolutely love the game, then it's not necessary personally. To end this segment off, the game has some fantastic ideas, and after a while, it could be enjoyable, but there are some major flaws like certain accessibility features not present, and some standard features for these type of action games like a health bar is missing. But I think the idea of killing these monsters and using these weapons to do major damage is what it would rather focus on than other stuff, and at least it's playable, but be aware of some of the harder stuff.
Finally, we can talk about the graphics and performance. No, Capcom did the best they could on the Switch version. It looked professionally made with how the environments are well made, especially in the forest areas and the detail on the monsters. The animation on the humans and monsters are very expressive and lively, making them fully realistic. Performance for me was fine. From what I've gathered, it said the frame rate was around 30 frames per second, which is fine due to it being on Switch and how much action it usually is. I probably said this in the story segment, but for the most part, the voice acting is pretty good, except for a few like my character voice lines in which she sounds stupid or not professional. As a whole, it works well together to form a good-looking game.
Learning to understand this game was hard, but after beating Magnolia, it's a game that has a good combat system with serious flaws, with accessibility and standard gameplay features. Of course, they probably removed them to make the game more unique, and that's fine. There is an audience for this type of game anyways. There really isn't a story, just to defeat a powerful monster because humans hate life. But basic character interactions and personalities have helped some characters feel likable and somewhat a joy to see. For a Switch game, this looks nice, and they really did the best they can to make this game look good. And it paid off, along with the performance being acceptable and make it playable. I'll give it a 6.3 out of 10. If you like what you see, then give it a shot like most games I review, but understand certain accessibility options are not present. No, fuck you fucking motherfucking asshole!
It's a wonderful day to go out and play. Hey, maybe you could come along. All you need to bring is a song to sing, a happy little baby song.